So I will do that. I want to, first, of course, I want to welcome everyone. It's really wonderful to see everyone from all over the world joining us today. And I know that many of you are new to Global Citizen Circle, so I'll take just a moment to introduce myself and the circle. My name's Theo Spanos Dunphy, and I'm the president and executive director of Global Citizen Circle. And our organization is celebrating its 50th year, having begun in 1974 at a similarly turbulent and polarized time in history. It's always been our belief that change begins with open and civil dialogue. It's why the Circle started in the midst of the war in Vietnam, the resignation of a disgraced US president, the civil rights movement, and the despair brought on by the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Medgar Evers. It's why we continue today, because we know that dialogue across differences is more important than ever. Listening to and learning from those from different backgrounds, races, religions, ethnicities, and opinions allows all of us to put people first and at the center. No one is above another in the circle, be they a world leader or a community organizer. Through circle conversations, we connect and engage in a way that advances the process towards constructive and sustainable social change. So I'm really happy to welcome you into the circle and excited that you're here for this conversation today with Ishmael and Libby. I mentioned the importance of connecting, and I think this story of how this program came about exemplifies it. I met Libby some years ago after her documentary Fumble Talk came out, and I discovered that she lived in the state of Maine in the United States, not far from where I live. I was teaching a course in global citizenship at the time, and I invited her to show the film and speak with my students at the University of New England. It was great, and she was great, but I didn't see her again until just recently after I read her book, Building Peace from the Inside Out. The Answers Are There, which is fabulous, and I highly recommend it. We reconnected over dinner in Portland, Maine, fairly recently, and I learned more about her continuing work in Sierra Leone. And to make a long story a bit shorter, Global Citizen Circle is now collaborating in a global peace conference that Libby and her organization, Catalyst for Peace, is organizing in Sierra Leone in October. Now, adding to that story of connection, I have another. Over the past several years, Global Citizen Circle has been thrilled to partner with the nonprofit Narrative 4, our co-host today. When I learned that Ishmael Bea, one of my favorite authors, was a founding member of Narrative 4's Artist Network, I immediately reached out to our friends at Narrative 4 and proposed this circle idea. And not surprisingly, Ishmael's and Libby's paths have crossed. In fact, I think they participated in a program in Portland, Maine some years ago. That's probably more than you wanted to know about how this program developed, but it does demonstrate the value of connections and collaboration, things that we at Global Citizen Circle hold dear. And with that, I'd like to invite another of Narrative 4's Artist Network, poet, playwright, and performer, Felice Bell, to say a few words about Narrative 4 before we move into the discussion. So over to you, Felice.
Thank you so much, Theo, and welcome to everyone joining us from around the world. As Theo mentioned, my name is Felice Bell. I'm the director of Narrative 4's Artist Network. And on behalf of N4, I'd like to welcome you all to the circle. We are super excited to continue our partnership with GCC for this event. For those of you who don't know Narrative 4, we are a global education organization. We have affiliates in Mexico, Ireland, Israel, Palestine, Nigeria, South Africa, just to name a few. And our goal is to equip young people to harness the power of their stories to drive change in their communities. And we do this through something called the Story Exchange. I won't get into what the Story Exchange is in full right now, but there will be some links in the chat if you would like to experience one. All you have to do is show up with a personal story that's true that you would like to share with a partner, and you're in. At Narrative 4, we believe that stories lead to action, lead to change. And I think Ishmael Bea and Libby Hoffman are both living examples of that ethos. So I am so looking forward to this rich conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Judah.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to welcome everybody and thank Global Citizen Circle, Narrative 4, Catalyst for Peace for hosting this program today, and especially to Libby and Ishmael for agreeing to take some time to join with us in what I have no doubt will be a very enriching and inspiring conversation. Just over the past 2 to 3 weeks, I've been reading Libby's book. I've been rereading Ishmael's book, the first of 3 of his books. And I'm so excited and so inspired. What they are doing and what they're going to share, I think really is innovative, cutting edge. It's showing the way for the things that need to be happening on the ground to help heal people and societies in a post-war setting. This is our 50th anniversary at Global Citizen Circle, and we've been highlighting the theme of peace building by featuring people and programs who have a specific facet of the lens of peace building, whether it was Gloria Steinem, feminism and gender equality, Alexandra Matvichuk, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in the Ukraine, looking at international law and human rights, and the grassroots dialogue and reconciliation work that's happening with the Parent Circle in Israel, Palestine, and Colin McCann with Narrative 4 was a part of that program. And today we're moving into the territory of transitional justice and restorative justice, looking at what works and what doesn't work in helping to heal people, communities, societies in the aftermath of violent conflict. And at the core of peace building in this context, it seems that certain things are required. And one of them is justice. But how justice is understood and implemented may differ drastically from one context to the next. Yet the international architecture that's been set up and implemented most often, from the International Criminal Court to war crimes tribunals to truth commissions, truth and reconciliation commissions, as important as they are, and they are, don't necessarily lead to a true repair of people, communities, and societies that are torn apart by violent conflict. And the people of Sierra Leone really suffered a brutal 11-year civil war that left over 50,000 people dead. It became internationally notorious for the widespread use of amputations, rape, sexual slavery, the targeting of children, many of whom were forced to fight and commit atrocities. And in the post-war setting, from the outside, Sierra Leone kind of looked for a while like a poster child for transitional justice processes. There was the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which was a hybrid court set up by the Sierra Leonean government and the United Nations, intended to prosecute the most egregious war crimes. In addition, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in an attempt to offer a restorative justice approach on the premise that public truth-telling can lead to a collective unburdening and create a record of the truth of what really happened. And while there were some important accomplishment from these processes, key questions arose in the wake of them as to whether or not either of them met the needs of the victims or were truly wanted by a majority of people. Is truth-telling of the variety mandated by Truth and Reconciliation Commissions always a redemptive process? Is it in concert with the inherent sensibilities, values, cultural worldview and wisdom of the people of Sierra Leone or any other culture? Is the retributive model of going after perpetrators to inflict punishment, which continues to be the most dominant paradigm of justice making worldwide, does that always serve communal and relational restoration? And who really holds the answers to what will lead to social healing and restoration? And it is this question that Ishmael and Libby are here to help us unpack today. So let's dive into that. Ishmael and Libby, this program is called Finding Peace from the Inside Out. I wonder if you could each share with us what that means to you. Anyone can start. Ishmael?
Libby, please go ahead. Women lead the way. Yes, I insist.
I'm happy to start, and although I think to some degree my answer is going to be a little less traditional, and because I think when we hear the phrase inside out, we often think in terms of the individual, and looking at our own inside and bringing that out. It's not that that's not important, but in the context of our work in Sierra Leone, and I've been had the great privilege of working there for the last 17 plus years now. Our great interest and commitment, and what I think is most necessary in terms of the work of building peace from the inside out, is for the people closest to the conflict to be the ones who get to lead in addressing it. And not just on their own, but well supported at every level from the outside. And that idea of inside out, creating the space for the people, culture, communities most impacted to lead, runs counter to not just mainstream peace building or the mainstream thought about justice and peace, but humanitarian aid in general. And we can come back to it if that would be helpful. But for me, one of the things that we have found in our work in Sierra Leone is actually critical to support people leading and addressing the issues that they're facing directly is community. It isn't just an individual process, it's a collective and communal process. And so a lot of the work for building peace from the inside out is actually creating the space, bringing people and communities together, so that they can repair the communal container that holds not only their individual lives and peace, but the community peace. And that's been one of the biggest lessons from my work in Sierra Leone, is the way in which the individual and the community have been interlinked, both at the level of identity and at the level of harm and at the level of repair. And I know we'll get to that a little bit more as we go. But for me, creating that space for those closest to the problems to lead in addressing them, and really valuing the power of community and of a whole community, and understanding the work that it takes to actually repair community containers after conflict and after any crisis. Over to you, Ishmael.
Thank you, Libby. And firstly, I really want to start by extending my gratitude to everyone who has gathered here, all the organizations part of it, and to all of you who have made the time to be part of this conversation. We're at a time in the world where it's rare to have moments like this, to be vulnerable in conversations like this, to be uncomfortable in certain ways, and to basically try and find ways to deepen our humanity collectively. We don't have these moments as much these days, so I want to thank everybody for making this possible. I want to start by telling just a small little story about my first introduction to the idea of justice, as a child growing up in a very remote part in Sierra Leone. And in the context of the Sierra Leonean Civil War, the people who were truly hurt by the war were the people who come from the inland, in the countryside. But when the idea of justice came about, the institutions that were built in the capital city, so away from the people who actually bore the brunt of what had happened, truly. So immediately there was already a disconnect from that. But let me tell you a story. When I was a boy in a very small village in the south of Sierra Leone, once there was a man who had caused tremendous harm to another. And basically, the way justice was rendered in my village was everybody will get together, sit around. The elders would be there, the chief, everybody, every child was invited, everybody was had a voice. And people went around and explained what had happened. The person who brought the case spoke. The person who the case was against spoke. People who were witnesses spoke. Everybody was asked to say what they thought about the matter. And together, it was decided who was wrong and what the punishment would be. And the punishment was not a punitive one, it was a restorative one. And it was that the man would spend time helping the other who he had wronged to brush his farm and grow his crops. Now, from an outsider, this may seem as though nothing is going to happen, but think about this. When you spend time brushing a farm with somebody using machetes and tools, you spend the whole day with them. You have a meal with them. You drink from the same gourd of water with them. Eventually, you're going to have a conversation with them about whatever it is that you two have dealt with together. And then you're going to heal by the time you return to town. Now, if you brush your farm several days in a row and you plant something, eventually you're going to return together as friends, which is usually what happens. So this was my initial introduction to the idea of justice, that it has to be owned by the people who suffer from whatever things that have collapsed due to injustice, right? And so when the war happened and when the war ended in Sierra Leone, when the special court was set up, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up, people didn't see these traditional ways, these ways they had come to understand justice being really part of how that was being dealt with, you know? And also you have to realize that the idea of an 11-year civil war, the idea of evidence when it comes to the way justice is rendered in a court system, it's hard to prove anything because you were running for your life when somebody wronged you. So you didn't stop to gather evidence. So then how do you deal with that? You know? And so there was a need, obviously, to hold certain people accountable. But we all knew that doing so for everybody was not going to lead us anywhere at all. That there were other methodologies that were needed, but there was no discussion for that at the time. So a lot of Sierra Leoneans felt, though the world held this the Special Court and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission very highly. Sierra Leone is one example, following the case of South Africa. I know there's some South African folks here. And so it was, for us, it felt like it was taken away from us. The participation in the process itself was taken away from us. You had to be in the capital city, if you could, or you had to have access to a radio to listen to it if it was broadcasted on the radio. None of these methods were really part of it. So for me, this was my introduction to understand that there has to be a fusion of wisdom, as it was mentioned earlier, of traditions, of methodologies to find what works for people, because people have to believe that justice has been rendered. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to anybody at all. So anyway, I will stop there. I know we'll get into more details of these things. But thank you again.
Thank you, Ishmael. I think this is a good place, Libby, to dive in a little bit to Fumble Talk and how it started, and share with us the story of Fumble Talk in any way you like, and lead us into, if you would, the video that we're going to see in a bit of time.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you again. And just echoing Ishmael's comment of really, I'm grateful for all of you who show up to engage in this way. I think taking the time away to not only think a little deeper, but feel a little deeper and feel ourselves located within these things that seem like big issues is, I think, really powerful and transformative. And I'm thrilled to be a part of it. So my friend and colleague, John Cocker, whom Ishmael knows now too, was a human rights advocate during the war and actually led a lot of the calls for he wanted a truth, justice, and reconciliation process. and wanted it to be located at the community level. And he wanted it to be drawing on the Sierra Leone culture and the tradition. Everyone said, it's never been done that way. It's never been done that way. And so he ended up heading up the civil society arm of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but in the end felt like there was this huge resource of the culture and the people that was left stagnant. And not only that, it never achieved reconciliation because most people impacted by the war weren't able to participate. And so he had a vision for building on just the culture that Ishmael was telling about, but couldn't get any support for it. And I would say this reflects one other challenge with the international justice system. And I would actually describe it as an injustice. If you have a concept of justice that is just one thing and it's totalizing, it can make other kinds of justice invisible. And that causes harm. I think it isn't just ignoring resources that actually causes more harm. And that's exactly what happened in this case. And John and I met in 2007 and had the chance to work together. I run Catalyst for Peace as a private granting and operating foundation. And our core commitment as a foundation was, what are the systems that support, how do we create the space for not only the people and community most impacted to lead, but to draw on all of the collective resources of people and community and culture? And what are the systems that support that? And so we've been committed to using our resources to live into that in practice. And that meant going deeper and longer term. And John and I decided to form a partnership in 2007 to create the program that the international community couldn't see, couldn't value. How do we do it? How do we live into it, into practice? And this tradition of coming together around the bonfire for truth-telling and apology and forgiveness, John knew to be a real resource. And so we decided to build the program around it. So you had people living next door to the person who might have amputated their arm or burned down their house or raped their mother in front of them or forced them to commit an egregious atrocity. And they'd never talked about what happened. And one of the other dynamics is that the community itself is an actor in the process and a resource. And so much of what I would call an outside in as opposed to inside out process had ignored the resources of the community and had further fragmented the communities. And the core of the Fumble Talk process became rebuilding the fabric of the community so that they could draw on their culture and their tradition to reconcile and achieve justice the way that they wanted. And when we asked what people said justice was to them, was a whole community. It wasn't about punishing and separating, but making the community whole again. And that included everybody, victim and perpetrator. And so that's been the core of the Fumble Talk process. And it's all run by people closest to the community, by Sierra Leoneans and by people from the very communities where these ceremonies have been facilitated. And it involves not just going in to do a ceremony, but creating the space over months of work for the communities to run it themselves. Because it's that work, it's taking more time up front that A, helps to heal the community, B, helps to make the work sustainable, and B, creates the safe container. It's actually part of the critical work of reconciliation. And in the first couple of years of the program, we documented it in film and produced a feature-length documentary film and premiered at South by Southwest in 2011. Ishmael actually came to our premiere. We're going to see a little clip from that film, and it takes place in the village of Dabu, just so you can see what this ceremony looks like. Dabu was a rebel stronghold during the Civil War. And so about half the community fled. Anybody who stayed was perceived to be either a rebel or a rebel collaborator. And they suffered some particularly egregious atrocities there. after the war, even as people came back, because that mistrust and that harm had never been addressed, there was never any capacity to move forward together. And so over the course of several months, this community, as facilitated by Fumble Talk, prepared for their bonfire ceremony, which again is drawing on their indigenous culture and tradition of truth-telling and apology and forgiveness around a bonfire. And you'll get a little window into that community and into the story of one particular example of the kind of reconciliation process that took place. We can talk about a little bit more after you have a chance to see the story.
So Phoebe or Theo, or who are our tech people that's gonna bring up the video?
Jane.
If
Moore.
we're ready, that would be me.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jane.
Let's make sure it's going to include the audio. Share sound. There we go. All right. Are you all seeing a black media player screen?
Yep.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to hit play. You may have to adjust audio on your ends. Depends. I do have audio turned on.
If you work with the people and you look at how we see things, we see that the community is alive. I mean, they are rich in some sense, rich in a sense of culture. Because of the war, it has been dormant. They've lost their dignity. That dignity is very important to bring that out and let them know that anything can be achieved if they come together collectively.
Famo talk, yema uye tega abi kugoba hema lolu tamu gamu na bo famo talk jili nava be nugate ga egba upia kugwa tapu ma otata wa pa otataru muntu tanu gbeho na nava ma be na ma fedu ta lopi agwa na mu toto ya ya.
I'm sorry, it went away.
Here we go.
There we go.
Later, because table boy you bet there later that Ghana better play chonko. That Ghana mo pia mo in this area football match is a match to read. This is our reconciliation is a mo pia fully is a match to read. That ba fully is here. We ja ko Roma Congo na ni match to that boy is a play goal le mu call okay. So play allow go now we. So Mr. Tawa, the manager, I want to confess. When you're not for Pata, while we move you, I would die. Now, Emek, I don't come out today. I confess.
The presence of the community, to them, that is the most important thing. Talking in front of the community publicly. For example, the woman whose child was beaten and later died. For the first time now, everyone knows this was what happened.
Now, Emek, I don't come out today. I confess that they left hacker for me. Nothing with the thing that now you are here, Mama Blappy.
Now I know go cool. Why I go better than ya be chale egwe mo kai na bia nya fu eji ko be nya de go yo ya go mo ya na go ya o mo le kura mo
rugbo abe o jima tatata na kenumo kesia dia tata bo na anya apuje adema
egwe na ye jo mo pe ha ko ma go mo pe ka ju ba na won gba tia o mo ri pe ra na ada ya
Nya gigo la samu kai di pe we amu koya na samu nya mu ni ati pe na ti lu ma ti manu mu ma mu pe mo aye ya
Maybe I will move a pie, Mole Juba. Happy Aguya. May I move by Agu?
The naming and shaming in our culture is a very serious punishment. It's a very difficult moment for offenders. For you to come publicly to say, yes, I did this with the praise of everyone, that's, to me, is justice. And for the victims, they're not carrying the burden alone. They carry the burden as a community. So we are dealing with these issues as a community to make sure it doesn't happen again. The surprise was for all of us when the district chairman
Thank you. That video is so deeply affecting. And one thing I don't think you've said yet, or maybe you did, that what Fumble Talk means, family
Yeah.
talk, right?
Family talk, yeah.
Family talk.
Which is really it's an ancient tradition in Sierra Leone of solving conflicts through conversation with the family. And of course, family is defined much more than just the biological family, but the whole community. So everywhere that I've been there, I've encountered this idea that when you hurt me, you're not just hurting me, you're hurting my family, my whole community. And so repair involves all of us and making the community whole again. And so that family talk tradition was what was revived as a way of healing the wounds of the war. And just one story that I'll share, Bishop, actually in northern Uganda, one of the founders of the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative, Bishop Achola, whose family was killed in the war, and he's led community-based efforts and government efforts to build peace there. But he talked about, if something is hot, too hot to hold, you need a fireproof container to hold it in, like fire. Otherwise, it'll burn you. And he spoke about, in his context, he described mercy as that fireproof container. It can hold even really hot, hard truths. And in Sierra Leone, I would say it was also community. To re-knit the bonds of the community, it becomes this container that could hold even really hot, hard truths of what had happened in the Civil War. So that Fumble Talk within the context of the community family.
So Libby, the two people, the man who asked for forgiveness and the woman who gave it, had been living side by side in that village for quite a number of years. Yes, and he had killed her daughter. He had
Her daughter.
beat
Yeah.
her to death. They'd never spoken about it. And this container offered them the possibility to really make right with that. And it's, what he said, carrying the burden in the community to make things whole, as opposed to her carrying it within herself.
She, in our interview with her afterwards, she literally described, they had lived, when the rebels came and Michael had been basically forced to become a rebel and forced to invade his own village. And Mariam and her family fled, and their daughter, 7-year-old daughter, left behind. They buried their food first and then fled. And Michael was at the, under command, captured the little girl and tied her to a chair to get her to tell them where the food was, and she wouldn't do it. And so they beat her, and she still wouldn't tell them. They beat her until she died. Now, after the war, Michael and Mariam had literally lived next door to each other and had never talked about it. But you can imagine when Dabu had a community meeting, if Michael was going, Mariama wouldn't go. If Mariam, so there were those kinds of hidden divisions in the community. But at this bonfire ceremony in Dabu, Michael was the first one to jump up after they had set the stage, he was so eager, and it was oftentimes the perpetrator, and there's a thin line between perpetrator and victim, right? The perpetrator was oftentimes the first one to get up. He wanted to get this off his chest. And so he then, after the ceremony, would carry water. He was committed to doing the things that if Mariama's daughter had stayed alive, she might be doing for the family. So carrying water and helping with the chores and helping with the community farm. And they would farm together side by side then going forward. And Mariama did this thing. She was the one who put her hands like this. She says, this ceremony doesn't bring my daughter back, but I was carrying the burden alone, and she had her hands here. And she said, now my community is carrying it with me. So in ways that are visible and invisible, it was transformative.
Ishmael, I'm wondering what happens when you watch this? What goes on within you in terms of memories of your culture in your early life, or any kind of feelings or comments that you want to make about being able to witness this healing within your own culture?
Well, first of all, the language that they were speaking in is my first language. It's Mende, so it's my tribal language. So the translation, everything was correct, just in case you're wondering. And one of the things that in Sierra Leone, I think we came to understand after the war is this idea between private peace or suffering and public, between individuality and community, between a village and a town and a city, how interconnected everything is. And we grew up knowing this. And actually there's a maxim, there's a saying in Sierra Leone that there is no bush to throw away a bad child, which means that every human being can redeem themselves no matter what happens. And over the years, I'm sure Libby can attest to this, when I started writing, I would tell a story about Sierra Leone, having lived in the West equally as I'd lived in Sierra Leone. Often there's a disbelief when people see these things. Well, how can they just forgive each other like that? Is that really possible? I don't think I'll be able to do that. People have all kinds of ways to say that this is not possible because they didn't grow up with that idea, that this concept for South Africans, which is Ubuntu, that we know that our lives depend on each other. And we know that until we're able to sit together and have a discussion, things would not heal. And healing or restorative component is more important to us than the punishment, because then the human being doesn't have a possibility to continue adding whatever goodness they have in them to society again, if you just lock them away. So this has always been part of. So when I'm watching this, I'm reminded again about this idea about how we often quickly forget that everything that happens communally affects you individually, vice versa. As a child in war, I would tell you, for example, when I came out of the war, there were 2 instances that I witnessed in Sierra Leone that showed the power of coming from that tradition and how strong it had been in people and how that did miracles in this country. For example, when the war ended, there were a lot of organizations that came into Sierra Leone to rehabilitate young people who had come out of war through various psychosocial therapies and put them in centers. And then after they were done healing them, they basically loaded them in cars and took them to their villages. And the villages says, no, we won't accept them because we were not part of the process, right? And people were very shocked because they thought, oh, if we just bring this child to you and tell you he's healed, he's recovered from the war, you should be sufficient. And they said, well, how do we know that? We were not part of it. So again, it was this request saying that we want to be, because when I'm healing, if I was a child in the war as I was, and I destroyed the fabric of my own culture, a place where I once could not raise my voice to an adult, and now I come with a weapon and shoot everybody. When I'm recovering, the people who had also need to recover with me because they'd experienced that trauma with me, even though that trauma is private, is also public. Right? So if they don't see it, that healing doesn't happen together, people can believe in it. There's no buy-in for it, right? So this request was made several times, and then the rehabilitation mechanism began to shift to say, all right, well, we're taking you to this community so that you can go through another round of rehabilitation for 3 more months, 6 more months, which I think in retrospect was actually good because some of us needed more time to recover. So then we had to do another one, but with the community this time. And then so when I'm watching this, I'm reminded again about something that it is so simple yet so difficult to do in the world, which is to truly sit together and hear each other.
Yeah. You know,
Listen without any bias, without any prejudgment, and really listen to each other deeply, feel each other, which is something that Narrative 4 does with building empathy as well. And then after that, come together again and reset what it is that we've broken within each other. And what I learned, which I will share, and I will stop as we continue this conversation during war, is this very same thing, which I think the idea of justice from a Western point of view, from a court point of view, doesn't really address, is that when you engage in violence, for you to destroy somebody's life or their existence requires dehumanizing them. But what people don't tell you is that in reverse, you dehumanize yourself as well. So when you live, you have to undo not only what you've done to the person, but to yourself as well.
Right.
And you can't do it alone because it doesn't work.
Right.
Just as when you engage in it, you dehumanize the other person, you have to do it together with them. But it's so difficult to find the space to sit down and do it and hear those explanations, because nowhere in the world anybody is born, I believe truly, that then decides that I'm just going to do these things. There are circumstances. And often when we don't hear those circumstances, when we don't hear where it started, we don't know how to repair it. So we're just kind of spinning the violent circle over and over again. And we can't get out of it, out of the loop. You know?
Right. Thank you. You know, Libby, you told me this individually, but when we see the film clip like this, there's also been a good amount of preparation and consultation with the village, the elders, the people of the village to set this up. So can you speak a little bit about, this is not just one night we all come together, but we've been working with the community, listening to the community, building the investment in this, so that what we saw in that clip was something that was a turning point or a culmination of a process that you and John and others were doing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you know, just like what Ishmael was saying, that we don't make the space for these kinds of conversations. First, they're hard, but then they take time and space. To take even a step back, we don't make the space to create those kind of spaces. And so for us as an organization, our programming was this process. It wasn't building a school or a health center or things that are visible. And most humanitarian aid programs are structured around linear accomplishment, where there's a visible end goal and you're always working towards that goal. And the process that Fumble Talk was committed to, it took several months to prepare a community to run that ceremony. And the first thing that Fumble Talk would do is go in to the communities and say, well, do you want to reconcile? A. B, how do you want to do it? C, what resources do you already have? And D, how can we walk with you in the process? And I'll just tell a story because it illustrates how radically unusual that is. In the same district where Dabu is, but in a different community, Manoa, we went and beginning of the process in that area, and you would bring together all of the stakeholders in the place where the paramount chief was based, and bring together all, you know, stakeholders, men and women, youth and elders, Muslims, Christian, victims, perpetrators, and go through that list of questions. And there was this was a place that did not think that they were going to ever experience reconciliation. But as soon as we asked them, do you want to? How do you want to do it? It was like, oh, all of a sudden it became alive. And there was this possibility, all this animated conversation. After about an hour, this one gentleman who was sort of on the side of the conversation stood up with this really almost regal bearing. Like you could tell he was a school teacher. He spoke very articulately and historically. And he said, this is the first time anybody has ever asked us what we want.
Yeah.
And then, and you know, there were probably 15 or 20 rusted NGO signs on the edge of this community. So clearly people had been there. But he said, you know, first the Christians came and they said, your culture is bad. You need Christianity. And then the Muslims came and they said, no, 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 your culture is haram. You need Islam. And then the British came and they said, no, 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 your culture is backward. You need our civilization. And then the war came and destroyed it all anyway.
Yeah.
And then the non-governmental organizations came and perpetuated. I mean, their experience of aid is that it's really colonialism in another form. And it is structurally, that is what it is. And so it's a radical idea, actually, to make space to ask people what they want. But then it takes a process to put in place for that community to plan it. So they identified the people that they thought of as the wise people in their community, men, women, not just elders, but people who had the community in their heart. And then Fumble Talk would train them and they would plan the ceremony. They had to gather the wood for the fire. They had to, and then I had a team of youth, girls and boys, that would go spread to the word to the neighboring communities, and they were trained for that. And at the ceremony itself that you saw wasn't the end of the process, it was the beginning. They would establish a peace tree where they would meet under. So when new conflicts arise, they would gather these elders that they had designated and gather under there and talk it through in an ongoing way. They played soccer matches together. They farmed together. They started peace mothers groups so that the women could work together and informally work to address the wounds that they still carried from the war. And so it really launched this multi-month, if not multi-year process, but left in place in the community, the structures. So it takes longer to set up, but then what happens stays. And the communities could move forward and finally begin to address, oh, we don't have a health center. Oh, we don't have funds to pay the school fees for our kids. Oh, what are we going to do about that? And they could come together and actually begin to address those things themselves. So doing it that way unleashed all of these resources in the community that were there all along, but just had to be activated.
Right. It must be absolutely sort of thrilling to be there in the midst of people coming alive, from A, being asked, B, being invested, and just being in that kind of vulnerable moment where they can share it exactly as it is and make that connection to, in this case, I don't remember his name now, but her and this man.
Michael,
I'm just feeling like there's something about it has an existential purposefulness to it that is just so powerful, of what can happen when you have a true human to human connection. Because what they're doing there is telling truths. Truth Commission brought in a place to tell the truth, but it wasn't the container that was going to work for people. In fact, my understanding is that there wasn't enough, people didn't feel secure enough to talk about it because they didn't know if they were going to be retribution on them or whatever. So there was no community within which to tell truths, as this shows. How many of these have happened now? Give us a little sense of where you are.
So this part of the Fumble Talks program took place from 2007 until about 2014-15, when the Ebola epidemic struck. And over the course of that time, Fumble Talk facilitated 250 of these reconciliation bonfires that involved over 2,500 villages. And I would just say about the TRC process, most people couldn't get there. They were held in the capital cities, and people don't have cars or even bikes or they can't leave their farming for the 3 days that it would take to even go to participate. Plus, the events were structured in a way where there was very little actually public comment time. And they were being separated from their community in order to do it. And as Ishmael's experience, as his story pointed out, it's like, it's about what happens in the community that really creates this container to hold it. But in any case, when the Ebola when the epidemic happened, everything had to kind of be put on hold. But what we discovered was that there was a repetition of the same aid pattern as after the war, this massive influx of a lot of money from the outside, very little of it going to the communities itself, most of it short term. And it caused more distrust in the communities. Whereas what we found is that the time of these local networks, and I think of them as local networks of care that were created through the Fumble Talk process, they were networks of trust. And those could be adapted really easily to do Ebola prevention. And they were. And so Fumble Talk adapted its program and used these local networks to say, no, this is, to really educate communities how to stop the spread of Ebola. And they were incredibly effective, much more than, and did two other things. Said, no, we need to create channels for community voices to be integrated into the national response here. And so organized processes that would support that happening. And then said, and by the way, we need to do this whole thing differently. We need to do crisis response and aid differently. And we've got another model. Sure. And so coming out of that, Fumble Talk adapted its community healing model to do Ebola recovery and then ongoing planning. And that's the work that we've been building on since then, and maybe can talk about a little bit more.
I want to open us to questions in a minute, but I'd love it, Libby, if you could tell in a brief form, tell the story of the Peace Mothers.
Yeah.
What is that? How'd that come about?
And I talked about this, the community committees that Fumble Talk would put in place in the communities to plan their own ceremony. Those had equal numbers of men and women in them. And all the structures that Fumble Talk did had equal numbers of men and women in them, because that was one of their fundamental commitments. But one of the things in the first 6 months of the program that we kept hearing was women saying, that's not enough. That's not enough. We suffered uniquely in the war, and we need a space to come together just as women. And so Fumble Talk does what it does, which is it brought together those women to ask them how they wanted to do it. And they said, we don't want a political structure. We just want time to space to get together as women. And we don't want a formal legal name. We just want to be called Peace Mothers. So what they wanted to do to heal from the wounds of the war was to come together and work together for the benefit of their communities. That was their understanding of how to heal, serve their communities together. But they also knew that it was in that informal time when they're together, and maybe it's clearing the brush to plant a farm, or maybe it's harvesting together, or maybe it's hiking up a hill to get water together, or whatever. It's in that time that they would be able to talk about the things that they couldn't talk about with anybody else. And that was an expansive space of healing for them. Mm-hmm. So, and it's unleashed incredible, like they are leading the nation right now in this incredible rebirth of local development. They're running community farms. They've built community centers. They've built health centers. They've mobilized to do violence prevention for national elections, and among other things. So, get women together and watch out.
Ishmael, come on, chime in here. Yeah.
I wanted to add that I think what Fumble Talk process and just processes that are embedded in indigenous wisdom does is give power back to the people, right? So, and not political power. I'm not talking about political power, but real power over decisions of your own life to do those things that because, for example, in Sierra Leone, we went through the war and we came out of a war that we knew very well. But then we had experts coming to tell us how we should recover from that war, who had never been in war, have never been hungry, have never lost their entire homes, none of these things. And all of a sudden, they have solutions for us.
Right.
So some of us were sitting there thinking, well, I mean, how does that even make sense?
Right.
You know, so I guess the question of asking people, what do you want, is to give them back the power to understand that actually, as we've been running to survive, as we've been running, we're doing all these things, we've thought about how we could end this for ourselves. We were not just passive sufferers. We were not just suffering and waiting for somebody to come and save us. We were thinking about ideas. We may not have the resources, but we've thought long and hard about what is happening to us. So oftentimes you see when these things are put in place, it's almost as if we have no intelligence, none whatsoever. And so when I came out of war, one of the things I wanted people to truly understand is that it takes intelligence to survive war. It's no people who survive are intelligent. That's what it takes to build that strength. So when you come and you don't ask them questions, there's a point of distrust already, right? For example, in my case, as a boy who came out of the war, when we came out of the war, one of the things that was being told to us was that, you know, we'll be sitting there and they would discuss our future. Everybody wanted us to be mechanics. This was one of the first interventions the UN did. And I was sitting there. First of all, I was a lieutenant in the war, so I was commanding a lot of young people. So I understood the idea of paying attention to people. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, I have not done a market research, but I can tell you that's not going to work. Because before the war, we had mechanics. And during the war, we burned most of the cars in the country. So if we all become mechanics, there are very few cars to fix. So all of a sudden, we get the skill set and we don't know what to do with it. So we're going to go back to the war. So I was sitting there thinking, but nobody was asking me, you know, so I just thought, all right, fine, let them do whatever they want to do. So what Libby is explaining is that what has happened here is that when people are asked, because they've been thinking about their lives, they've been thinking about their communities, and sometimes what they want is to build the Barry, which is a gathering area that used to exist in the community that had been destroyed during the war. Because once you create that, people will gather there, and from there, they can make decisions for how their community come back together. But there is there's nowhere in the budget line where you can put that. So it doesn't work for people who are coming to build a court barrier. So all of a sudden, that's not useful, but that's actually what is most important. And lastly, I would like Libby to mention this because I spoke to John a lot about this. The cost that it took for the Special Court and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to be formed was in the millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And as opposed to the cost that it took for Fambutok to do what it did.
Yeah.
Right? So I will let Libby answer that question, just so you see, even when it comes to what is effective in terms of budget, what it can do, how much. And lastly, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up along the Special Court, very few people were told what this meant. So when you came to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to talk, if there was evidence there that can be used in the court, they took that evidence. So people began to destroy because it was like we weren't coming to hang people. We were coming to have a conversation, right? So many things, but I would really love Libby to talk about just the amount, how much it's night and day, the cost. I won't say it because I think you should say it.
Yeah. Well, no. And the film ends actually with a statement of just that. So the special court, and this is the head of the UN in Sierra Leone who was in charge of, this is his number, cost $500 million to prosecute 13, well, really 9 men. $500 million. And all 250 of those reconciliation bonfires facilitated over 2,500 villages was under $5 million. Well under $5 million at that point. So the cost effectiveness, but here's the thing, like it requires a completely different approach for somebody who's coming in and wanting to support this from the outside. Everything about my training in international peace building and international affairs, international security, I was trained to be an expert, to be the one who had the answers. And I've had to systematically unlearn that. And really the most powerful and transformative thing is to come in as a learner, a listener and a learner. And it's counter to everything we've taught, but there's a transformational power in listening. Nell Morton calls it listening into speech or hearing to speech. But it requires as much unlearning for those of us who want to support the work from the outside as learning. And that's a core theme that in my book is my own learning journey, what I had to both learn and unlearn in order to work this way, because it is radically different than the way the status quo system is set up.
That's right. I'm going to move us along to some questions because people have questions, and I just want to make sure that before we end, that you and Ishmael have a little bit of time to talk about what's next, where it's gone and what's coming up for you. But let's go to some questions first. And Sudi, where are you? You have a question, and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Judith. This is unbelievable, and I'm so grateful to be listening and hearing and learning from you all. The thing that is coming into this, all I keep thinking about is how divided the world is right now, and how many different places there are so many atrocities going on, and I'm wondering what thoughts you have on how we can how we can replicate the models that you've used to engage in these conversations and to heal and to unlearn and to learn and to build peace in spite of kind of all the divide that we are seeing so prevalent everywhere.
All right, Ishmael, I'm going to let you take this one first.
Well, when we agreed to this conversation, I think we had all said that this is a conversation, it's a lifelong discussion, really, but how to use this, for example, Catalyst for Peace have what they do, and you can watch the film and learn what the models are through Fambu Talk. But I think it starts with truly just undoing a lot of the things we've been told work in the world, as Libby said, and I think it's a very difficult thing to do, but it is the only way to move forward, and to understand truly what this means. Understanding this very simple principle that every human being in the world has something to teach you. It doesn't matter who they are, where they come from. It's very simple, but they do, right? And so coming from that point of view, the world is yours to constantly learn from. And by doing so, you begin to see people truly for the humanity of who they are, not what society has coined them to be or various other things, right? Because that can give us the possibility to miss so many remarkable people, right? So just allow yourself the space to learn. That's what I would say. That's the beginning. And there are tools, whether through Narrative 4, through Catalyst for Peace, through this conversation we're having, that you can continue to build that, to find community of people who are doing that. The undoing is actually the real learning. So it's not that you're forgetting the things that you've been taught. It's that you're stripping away at the gem of who you are as a human being, so that you can find truly that matters. Yeah. Really, that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And the only thing I would add to that is do it in community. Do it together with others. Read Ishmael's book or read my book together with, or watch the Fumble Talk film together with others and talk about it. And look at where you are and come together and talk about what you can do. It really is just one of my favorite expressions in Sierra Leone is small, 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 small. Oftentimes it's used because things don't go the way you think they should go. You have to be patient. And it's like, taking one step at a time, small, small. And the thing I say to John is small, small over time is big, big. And you don't have to go to Sierra Leone to do this. Like somebody just sent me an example of this great project in Lewiston, Auburn that is organizing, that's in Maine, where I am, community-driven versus donor-driven approaches to whatever the issues were that they were doing. I have another colleague who leads great work in Manchester, New Hampshire, the Manchester Community. I should know the name of it, but I can't off the top of my head. But wherever we are, there are organizations really working to unleash the power right in our own local communities. And so we don't have to go far or think we have to go far to do it.
Thank you. We've got another question from Dr. Marguerite Miriama. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Is she still here? Or did she leave?
Unmute,
Here
Margaret.
I am. I was talking away.
There
Sorry.
you are. Okay.
It's always great to be here with the Global Citizen Circle. I love this family. I just wanted to revisit the idea of the non-European cultural frameworks and those ways of knowing that have been dismissed all over the world. The colonial mindset has absolutely, in some ways, destroyed the African sense of knowing and being all over the globe, actually. And so we need to find ways of restoring and renewing those cultural frameworks, which I think could become a beacon and a light for the world right now, because there are other ways of doing things that we have not embraced for ages, and we need those ways of doing things, those ways of knowing, in order to bring light and love back into the world. And I'm just wondering about the sessions, how important art has been in terms of sort of setting the stage for those reconciliation conversations. Because I thought I saw music and dance at the beginning of the process, which kind of smooths the way and helps people embrace their shared humanity outside of the box, so to speak, so that those linear conversations have a human side to them. So I'm just wondering if that played a part in, or plays a part in these discussions.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful question. In my experience in Sierra Leone, they wouldn't necessarily call it art, they would call it culture.
Yes, yes. Music and dance in particular.
Yeah. And there's a, because, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Because so much of what has happened in Sierra Leone has been others saying your culture is bad. What Fumble Talk's starting approach has been is your culture is good. It's an important resource and it's enough, and inviting it not only into the picture, but in a leading role. And what are the cultural resources there to help you address even the wounds of war? And so culture was embedded in, first of all, the ceremony itself is culture. There were cultural performances, almost every community, and they all did it differently, but started off the ceremony with different cultural dances or performances, depending on what was local to their region, performances, dances, and then the second part of every ceremony after the bonfire, the next day, they would have a cleansing ritual, again, drawing on their ceremony, which often had a dance component to it. It just, again, it varied. But music and dance, in so many of the communities, it was music and drumming in particular that was part of the ritual of gathering. You knew there was a time to gather when the music started playing. And dance was just part of how people gathered. But it was embedded within this sort of recommitment to centering culture, and to recognizing that it's a critical resource for both community and individual healing, in that way.
Beautiful. Ishmael,
I also want to add that I think for us in Sierra Leone, art culture is not just a universal language, but it's also a way to call on the ancestors to give us their wisdom. So wherever you go, you have that call is made. And that call is not past, it's not present, it's also future, right? So the conversation is happening because we believe in the spiritual world, not in the sense of that you die, you not anything like, but everything that exists has a purpose, right?
Yeah.
So when you beat the drum, you're calling on everything possible. And we also believe that memory exists not only in your head, but also in your bloodstream, in your veins. So the way you move to a certain beat, it evokes certain things in you so you can connect to the moment, right? So we have all of these traditions that are there. They are funny moments. Sometimes somebody would be a comedian in the beginning just to soften the space a little bit, you know, because humor is also medicine. It allows people to take in information that is difficult. So there are all these things that are happening, as Libby said, that we've been told were useless over the years because of the colonial structure. In fact, our ceremonies during colonial times, and even now with some of our very colonized leadership, calls our dances devil dances, because that's because the people who came could not understand it. They call it the devil dancing. And we're like, well, there's nothing devilish about it. It's actually pretty straightforward if you look at it. But anyway, so over the years with Fambu Talk and with other ways, people have been inviting themselves back to that. And what the war did is that it urbanized Sierra Leone. So these kind of exercises also exist in the countryside, right? Yeah. Well, most people are in the city, you don't have much of this. So hence you have a lot of psychological issues in the city because people are disconnected from their roots, from their traditions. So things easily destroy them. The small doesn't work as much.
Yeah.
Because you're not saying it with the old granny that you know from before who knew your grandfather. So therefore, there's a lineage there. There's a strength there that you can borrow when you need it. So again, community, going back to that. So art for us is that. It's all of that conversation.
Yeah.
We have
May I just say one more thing about that? Thank you for that, Ishmael, because one of the things that happened to African Americans when we came here was the first thing that was taken from us was the intention was to take and remove us from our cultural understanding, right? So like what you just described, the dance was devil dance. Well, our music was called devil music, and we were not to be able to engage with it. And the art forms, that is dance music and drumming and drama and humor, were used as healing and education and ritual tools and for celebration as well. So there, the similarities are just stark. Yeah. And they needed to be embraced here, and they need to continue to be embraced on the continent as well.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Marguerite. Abigail Farley has a question that I think may segue with what this conversation is. Abigail?
Hello?
There you go.
So my question is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is about collective memory. I live in the United States. I actually live in Mass and go to school in New Hampshire. And in the United States, we particularly have a very tense collective memory of the Civil War. We even argue about the objective facts about what was it about, symbols about it, like the Confederate flag, and argue about that, despite we knowing one of those collective memories not being true. So how can you really make peace with those kind of deeply entrenched collective memories?
I guess, first of all, I think Fambu Talk, by sitting together and the ceremony itself, is beginning to have people deeply understand the context. Because the war happened to people and they ran, that happened. For example, I tell you something, I was a child in the war. When I came out of the war, most people did not know that a child was forced in the war. They thought the child went to the war because he was just a violent individual. So it took time for people to understand that context, to realize that we didn't go to it. There was no other choice. right? And that context changed. But here is what, again, it's another way that we looked at what truth is. I lived in the United States for many years. There's an obsession with the singularity of truth. We want the truth to be singular. We all agree that it was one thing that happened. This is how it happened. Where's that one thing that could fix the education system? Where's that one thing that you can take to lose weight? Where's that one thing? But there are several things you can do. So from where I come from in the world, we believe in the plurality of truth. So we don't have to agree on what happened, exactly how it happened. We all just have to agree that at some point our humanity was unhinged. We are all destroyed, we all fell apart. How that happened to you and me, it's your story, it's their story, and all of them are important. So when we sit together, that's what we hear. So we don't, immediately we don't have to deal with that whole point of collective this and that because we believe things are different, right? For example, all of us are here tonight, we're having this discussion. What is truthful is that we're here. When we leave, how we render this story, this experience to other people will be very different because we all come at it from different vantage points. Does that mean that we're all liars? No. You understand? So I think that's for us. Anyway, that's
beautiful.
So maybe that's one thing to pick up from as well, you know? Yeah.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Ishmael. Wow.
And I think one of the skills that we need, in addition to that, which is just beautiful, I almost don't want to add anything to it. One of the things that I've really appreciated in my experience in Sierra Leone is the way that Fumble talked, the making the space for frank conversation about difficult things and valuing the work of having difficult conversations. And we have seen, how much work that takes and how transformational it can be when you do it. And again, a couple of things in this context that have supported that are coming together as community, knowing that it isn't in one moment, but that it's over time. And your orientation, the fundamental orientation, when you're imagining yourself as side by side, somebody working forward together, having some common work together, that gives you a basis for having the really difficult conversations. And so cultivating our capacity for discomfort, I find to be a really important skill. And for me, what that looks like also is cultivating my willingness to say a hard thing, which means either I risk hurting somebody or making somebody else uncomfortable, or I risk saying something that makes me look stupid. Like there's all different ways in which things are hard. And then cultivating my capacity to hear hard things. I might feel a wash of shame if I did something wrong. And I don't want to stay in that place, but I have to strengthen my ability to do that, to work through to whatever the right thing is on the other side of that. And it doesn't always come instantly. So just cultivating that willingness to be in those uncomfortable spaces, and to actively seek them out, and to trust that discomfort is there for a larger creative purpose. Those are some sort of general things that I would add from my experience.
Thank you.
Judith, I think you're muted.
So sorry. I think we'll take one more question and then we'll move into wrapping up by hearing from Ishmael and Libby what they're doing now and what's coming up that they want to share with people. So Brown Marshall has a question.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ishmael. I've read your book. Thank you, everyone. I'll make it quick because I'm off camera. How can we do what Libby has just said as a nation in the West when we haven't really faced the atrocities we've done to people in our own country, the indigenous, the people of African descent, of Latin America? There's so many people we've harmed in our own countries, and yet we keep going to Africa and other countries pointing the finger and talking about their atrocities. And it just seems like we haven't faced our own and continue to deny colonialism and slavery. So how do we go forward with that work you're talking about, Libby, when there's the power of escaping at every moment?
Good question.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of, like so many things, there's not a singular answer to that. There's a lot of answers. And I think to me that goes to what I was saying about that willingness to be uncomfortable and cultivating the spaces for those uncomfortable truths. I mean, until one of the things that we kept hearing in Sierra Leone is that it would re-traumatize people to go back and tell the stories of what happened in the war. And John kept really arguing against that and highlighting and pointing to the resilience of people, and especially people in community. And so creating community spaces that can hold that was a critical part of that. But B, knowing that people are strong enough to handle the difficult truths. And I think we certainly have a long way to go in that, in this country. And it's also happening. It is happening in ways. And so I guess I'm just endorsing the idea. I think until we as a nation can face the hard truths, we are so committed to our own narratives of our own innocence. And we commit such harm to others to try to preserve those narratives of innocence. And until we cultivate our capacity to face the hard truths about our own nation and not feel that undermines us, but actually our capacity to do that strengthens us. You know, I think I'm agreeing with you that I think these are capacities that are critical for us to cultivate as a nation, and that they will strengthen us rather than weaken us.
And I really would like the truth of the European undermining of Africa that is so often at the root of some of the more modern conflicts. And that's just starting to come out as well, of how Europe has caused in so many very intentional ways the conflicts between groups in Africa, and then step back and say, look at those people, see how they're abusing their freedom that we gave them in independence, when pre-independence colonialism is at the root of a lot of the conflict. But that's what I'll end with. But we need to read about that and have a better sense of how Europe and America played a role in Sierra Leone and so many other places.
And we need to do better. And we need to be courageous in doing better, which means doing things radically differently than they've been done in the past. And so I think we need to be as committed to radically doing better as we are to being radically honest.
Ishmael, yeah.
Yes,
Sure.
I want to add that I think on doing all of this, what you had mentioned for the question, requires all of us to, in whatever small community and capacity we have, to begin to ask those difficult questions, you know. And then, as we're saying, small can become big. But if we all just try to ignore that this is not the big elephant in the room, it will continue. I'll give you one or two quick examples that I've done. A few years ago, I was a visiting professor at Rutgers University in Newark. You know, they gave me an office, some graduate students to go find books. I tell them to find everything. But I realized that next door, they had the Bloods and the Crips, and they were afraid of them. And here I was, a former child soldier kid who fought in the war, did all. And I had this office to do all this stuff. And I thought to myself, well, this is not good. I can't be functioning. So I left my office and I walk in the neighborhood. I encounter some of these really horrible kids they were talking about. And I realized that some of these kids were amazing poets. So I brought them back to the university and had a poetry competition between the Bloods and the Crips. That the university didn't like that very much. It's just, right? They thought it was going to be violence. But basically what I was trying to do is this, that it is so easy for you to have empathy for me all the way thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. What about next door to you? Can we get to know the context of the lives of some of the young people? And one of the young people told a simple story about the fact that he grew up in America. He didn't have food to eat. He was hungry as I was when I was running from the war. So what he learned to do was to think intelligently. Call the Chinese food store and say, hey, we order food up to $40 and say, I have 100. Can you come with a change? And when the guy comes, they take the change from him and the food. And then the police respond. And I said to them, for us in Sierra Leone, that would be like the child is hungry. Somebody's going to feed that child so they don't have to do that again. But immediately that kid goes into the system, right? So anytime you have a moment, try to challenge people to see things differently, right? We learn from each other. Even in these places where people are trying to hide, there are lessons to learn from how they're doing that. So for me, I'm always open to learning. Where can I pick knowledge? How can I push people a little bit so that they're uncomfortable, but also learn something? And lastly, the idea, I live in the United States, I'm American, I lived there for so many years. We are so afraid to challenge what we believe, as if we do, it's going to collapse completely and never exist again. No, actually, it will strengthen it.
Yeah.
If you challenge your belief system, it strengthens it. It doesn't get rid of it. But that small area, people don't want to deal with it. So you can't ask that question. You can't do this. You can't do it. Anyway. So any movement here in an environment, find a way to do it. Disrupt. Non-violently if you can, Sometimes it doesn't work. Anyway.
And just to add one more thing that's different from that, but I think it's connected. There's a subtlety, this idea that we have so many problems. We've never addressed our past. We haven't done this. We haven't done that. We've got all these, like when we are really focusing on the bigness of the problems, I think I would say we have to be careful that we're not giving away our power in that. So therefore, nothing will ever change. Because I think that's one of the ways, one of the really subtle ways that our own power, the power that we have to make a difference right here today in some small way, that we consent to give that away. And I don't think we can consent to give that away. So be careful not to be seduced by a perceived inevitability of the bigness of the problems that we're facing. Because ultimately, the only thing we're asked to do is what's right here in front of us.
Beautiful, Libby, thank you. I'm going to move us into a little bit of a wrap up. And those who want to stay on, what we generally do is we said it would end at 1:30, and those people who need to leave at 1:30 will do so. And people who want to stay on and talk can do that. But I'd like them to hear, Libby, from you and Ishmael. What do you want people to know about sort of the current state of what you're doing and what's coming up, things that you want to make sure people know about?
Yeah. I'm happy to jump in. I guess, and I know you all have been sharing this throughout, but I just, I'll say one more time that I have a book, The Answers Are There, Building Peace from the Inside Out. And it really aims to be a way that not only is it telling these stories, but it's weaving my story and the ideas into it in a way that's meant to be invitational for you as a reader to think about it in your context. So I really invite you to read it, and especially read it with others. Where we are right now, so the work in Sierra Leone, I've talked about how this way of working is as much of a problem, the status quo ways of working. And in the 17 years that I've been working with Fumble Talk, we've helped that work and that program grow after Ebola and adapt to a people and community-led whole planning and development process. And one of the gifts of the Ebola epidemic was that it really made everybody much more committed to finding out how to do things differently. And so we've been working with the national government of Sierra Leone to adopt a national policy framework around this approach of people and community-centered approaches. And they have. They've changed the local governance legislation. They've changed centered the whole national development planning process around this people and community-led way of working. And now we're working with them in the World Bank and others to implement it. Our big focus is actually to try to create more space for people to work from the inside out, whether it's in peace or development or whatever. And so that's our focus, is gathering teams of leaders from different countries who are really committed to working this way, including from the United States. And that's this global learning space that Theo alluded to at the beginning of the process. And we're launching a year-long process with teams from around the world. And so that's just what I'm excited about. I think there's a huge potential to really grow this new way of working, and to center the leadership and the capacities of those closest to the issues, and to help those of us who support from the outside learn how to create and hold space and accompany, instead of come in as fixers and savers.
Thank you. Thanks, Libby. Ishmael, what about you?
Thank you. Well, I'll mention many things, but two briefly. One of them is really building empathy in the world. And I'm part of an organization called Narrative 4 that has been around for a while. And what we're trying to do is to really catch human beings at a very young age, from when they're students, but also older people, just to create spaces to have an empathetic world where people learn about each other through their stories truly, and be able to meet them at the humanity, because we believe that perhaps, as Colum McCann, one of the founders, says, stories are the only democratic things left in the world, really, because everybody has them and everybody can learn from them one way or the other. So it's a remarkable organization. Check us out. I'm on the South Africa board, planning on moving to South Africa in October, finally. So I'll be there working on a lot of projects. I'm also part of the Artist Network. So we bring art and empathetic storytelling and peace building into schools, into communities around the world. As Felice mentioned earlier, we're in many places and we're looking to expand and also create partnership with people who are doing similar work in the world, because we believe that, if we have more empathetic individuals in the world, we can make different decisions in the world, and therefore we would have less things to deal with that are prone to conflict. That being said, the last thing I'm excited about is that I finally finished a draft of the sequel to my first book, memoir. It took me a long time to write it, more than I had thought. And the reason for that is that I truly wanted to revisit some of the places that I'd been to be able to write about them again, but also just to feel certain things. And I know that there are some people here from South Africa. So when I left Sierra Leone as the first book ends, I went to Guinea, Conakry. From there, I went to Burkina Faso for a bit. I went to Ivory Coast. I went to Cape Town, South Africa, and I lived there. And this was in 1998. So some years after apartheid had ended, and I started reading Steve Biko and South African thinkers from there. So who I am was formed along all these places that I picked up this knowledge from along the way. So that's something that's really been exciting to think about. And because coming from Sierra Leone, I grew up as a Muslim. My grandfather was an imam. I learned the Quran before I went to English school. My grandfather's best friend was a reverend. So when I went to secondary school, he made me go to a Christian secondary school. So then I learned the Bible. And I was adopted in a Jewish family in New York. So I went to, so I'm all over the place, So as I was writing this book, I realized to myself, listen, there's so much in common because I've been in all these traditions. There's no, so anyway, check it out whenever it comes out. But I'm basically trying just to build empathy in the world, to show people that, listen, like, we have so much more in common than the simple things that separate us, and that's from my experience of living as well.
They couldn't find a better communicator than you, Ishmael. I mean, you really put it out there, and thank you for that. I also want to say, for those who have not read Ishmael's books or Libby's books, they are truly wonderful books, and they're both extraordinary writers. So it's a pleasure to read them too, because the language, the lyricism, Ishmael, that you employ in your writing is so beautiful. So everybody make sure you get those books if you haven't gotten them already. And Theo, shall I throw it over to you as a final?
Sure. I want to just take a moment to thank all of you for being here today. I really want to thank Ishmael and Libby and Judith and Felice for participating and helping us to make this program possible. It really, I knew this was going to be a special program, and I didn't know how special it would be hearing from all of you. And so thank you again for this. And as Judith said, we often have just conversation after the program, the formal part of the program ends. So I don't want to keep anybody. If you have to leave, it's completely fine. We stay on for a little bit after, and sometimes there's some interesting chats that happen. So I welcome you to stay with us a bit longer if you'd like to. Otherwise, we will see you at the next time we do a program. If you were invited to this program and you accepted the invitation to this program, you are in our database and you will receive future invitations to our future programs. So I look forward to seeing everyone again.